Hey everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, in our 35th session, we launch ourselves toward the final confrontation with the Shadow in Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea. We overcome darkness and cold and ancient evil. We seek refuge with an old friend, and then finally, we turn the tables. It's going to be a tough ride tonight because we have 3 chapters to get through. This is our penultimate discussion of A Wizard of Earthsea, and by penultimate, I really mean penultimate because, well, Christmas is coming, and there's a skip week right there between Christmas and New Year, and we have to start Goblet of Fire in the New Year. So we're really going to push through as many slides as we can this evening and see what we can do to delve into the thematic complexity that lies at the heart of A Wizard of Earthsea. This is not, of course, our first engagement with that thematic complexity. That thematic complexity has been present throughout the novel. One of the things that I really want to focus on tonight as we move forward is the degree to which people in Earthsea, characters within this novel, can be wrong. Characters can mislead Ged. Ged himself can assert things which turn out later to be untrue. And there's an interesting kind of dramatic irony present at the heart of this work, that the confrontation between light and dark, light and shadow, is not quite what we are led to believe. And when we get a revision to our initial understanding of that conflict, that isn't right either. You know, we're going to continue to evolve and refine our understanding as Ged's understanding is evolved and refined. So we're going to look at the ways in which Ged's conflict against the shadow, Ged's role in the world, the role of old magic, the old powers in the world are defined and then broken, subverted, cast aside, and replaced with something more sophisticated that is still nonetheless incomplete. We're moving closer and closer to that completeness. We're not going to hit that this week, of course. We're not going to get to the fullest measure of our understanding of the thematic landscape before us, but we are going to take some big steps in this week's reading. We're going to begin with chapter 6, Hunted. Before that, previously in A Wizard of Earthsea, Ged, who is called Sparrowhawk, has unleashed the shadow and is hunted across the face of Earthsea. He takes the job with the villages of Low Torning, faces down the elder dragon of Pendor, and has now decided to return to Roke to figure out what is going on, and of course, to seek some refuge too. We have Rayla Lynn, and we have Becca, and we have Nikki, and we have Jin and Karen, and Father John is with us, and so many people joining us tonight. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I know that sometimes schedules are hard to resolve this close to the holidays, but I'm very, very glad that you are all here. Last time we started chapter 6, we looked at the celebration that heralded Ged's return to Low Torning, this one night of peace and of joy that Ged experiences as songs are sung, and as the news of his victory over the Dragon of Pendor spread out through the 90 Isles, right? We get this account of the song being sung, of the song being written, of the tale being taken from Ged, in fact, and refined, of the story itself becoming better, becoming more powerful, more compelling. And it is a song not just of Ged's greatness, which of course would sit uncomfortably with his ambition, with his desire for acclaim, his desire for approbation from the people of the world, but is more a story of the vanquishing of evil and the safety of the 90 Isles now. So we're going to get into our story, picking up from that celebration as Ged begins to return to Roke. He sets sail. He's feeling pretty good. He's feeling, positive about his return to the wizard school, to the magical island of Roke. But things don't work out as well as he hoped, because the wind itself responds to him. The wind of Roke, it would seem, pushes back against his ship, and we get this slide here. Ged grabbed hold of a stanchion, for she almost lay over on her side, and shouted out, "Turn back to Surd, master!" The master cursed and shouted that he would not. "A wizard aboard, and I the best seaman of the trade, and this the handiest ship I ever sailed. Turn back!" Then the ship turned again, almost as if a whirlpool had caught her keel, and he too grabbed hold of the sternpost to keep aboard. And Ged said to him, "Leave me at Surd and sail where you like. It's not against your ship this wind blows, but against me." "Against you, a wizard of Roke? Have you never heard of the Roke wind, master?" "Aye, that keeps off evil powers from the Isle of the Wise. But what has that to do with you, a dragon tamer?" "That is between me and my shadow," Ged answered shortly, as a wizard will, and he said no more as they went swiftly with a steady wind and under clearing skies back over the sea to Surd. So Ged here at least understands what is happening. "Have you heard of the Roke wind, master?" "Aye, that keeps off evil powers from the Isle of the Wise." Ged is carrying with him the evil now. And we're getting the sense that for all that the shadow is real in the world. For all that the shadow exists apart from Ged, it is still connected to Ged, which ties back to a question that we answered, or a question that we raised, a question that we partially addressed last time when we were talking about Ged's connection with the shadow when first he came to Roke Island. You'll remember, as he steps through the threshold into the wizard school of Roke, we get that beat about as Ged walks into the light, the shadow is at his heels. And is that the shadow? Or is that something else? Is that, is it thematically synonymous with the shadow, or is it actually the shadow? Is there something now dogging Ged's heels as he moves through the world? And the answer seems to be yes, though even now we can't be certain. Is the wind blowing specifically against Ged? Is the wind blowing against something which is following close after Ged? Well, there's no indication of pursuit at this point, but it may still be possible that the shadow is present but distinct from Ged. But certainly the wind is blowing nonetheless, and we must turn back to Serd here. I love the naming of all the islands that we get here. They're so unconventional. They are incomplete, I suppose. They are kind of linguistically incomplete and somewhat linguistically inconsistent. Certainly, Le Guin hasn't spent the time developing her constructed languages in the manner of J.R.R. Tolkien, for example, but there is still a beautiful uniquity to the names of the islands and the names of many of the characters that will hit as we move through this book. Eve says, oh man, I'm so excited to be here live again. I had a question last week. There was a mention of the spirit Ged summons being Ged's mother. I thought that was really interesting because I had always read that as A, being literally Elfaron, and B, being the inciting incident that causes the connection between Ged and that particular story. Like the shadow leaves him on the island with the ring. Interesting. Well, you know what? Let's stick with our thread of narrative here, because certainly we're going to get another explanation offered for the existence of the shadow, and certainly the shadow's interest in Ged, right? By the time that we reconnect with Seret in Oskill, we're going to see another account of what is happening in the world and another account of the danger that Ged is facing. So that may help refine our understanding of what is happening, or as I say, may also be an incomplete step forward. Yes. Father John says, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. Very good. Yes. A very different kind of shadow pursuing Ged here. So we try to sail to Roke. We are thwarted in our desire. We return to Serd, and Ged makes a plan. No one in this place knew him. Oh, this is actually after we get to Oremy, I believe. No one in this place knew him. They were travelers from other isles who had not heard the song of the sparrowhawk. None spoke to him. He chose a pallet at last and lay down, but all night long he lay with open eyes there in the raftered hall among the sleep of strangers. All night he tried to choose his way, to plan where he should go, what he should do, but each choice, each plan was blocked by a foreboding of doom. Across each way he might go lay the shadow. Only Roke was clear of it, and to Roke he could not go, forbidden by the high and woven ancient spells that kept the perilous island safe. That the Roke wind had risen against him was proof the thing that hunted him must be very close upon him now. That thing was bodiless, blind to sunlight, a creature of a lightless, placeless, timeless realm. They must grope after him through the days and across the seas of the sunlit world, and could take visible shape only in dreams and darkness. It had as yet no substance or being that the light of the sun would shine on, and so it is sung in the deed of Hode, quote, daybreak makes all earth and sea, from shadow brings forth form, driving dream to the dark kingdom. But if once the shadow caught up with Ged, it could draw his power out of him and take from him the very weight and warmth and life of his body and the will that moved him. That was the doom he saw lying ahead on every road. And he knew that he might be tricked toward that doom. For the shadow, growing stronger always as it was nearer him, might even now have strength enough to put evil powers or evil men to its own use, showing him false portents or speaking with a stranger's voice. For all he knew, in one of these men who slept in this corner or that of the raftered hall of the sea house tonight, the dark thing lurked, finding a foothold in a dark soul, and there waiting and watching Ged, and feeding even now on his weakness, on his uncertainty, on his fear. So we're asserting things to be true about the shadow, and we're, in the process of that assertion, giving more exposition about the nature of the world, particularly here about the nature of the sunless realm that we discussed earlier. This is the sunless realm into which Ged ventures when he is at Low Torning, when he goes to rescue the boatmaker's son. He goes beneath the sunless sky. He travels into the dark realm in pursuit of the soul of the departing boy, but then finds the shadow there, blocking his way back to the land of the living. And the shadow here is once again connected to death, connected not just to death as the absence of life, but connected to a kind of forcible and active unlife. This is the opposite of life. This is anti-life, if you like, that is now, presumably always has been in its natural form, engaged in an open conflict against light and life and joy and goodness. And we see here that it is connected even in the sunlit world with those things which speak to the darkness themselves, those elements of darkness which are present in all men. We see in this last line, watching Ged and feeding even now on his weakness, on his uncertainty, on his fear. So as the shadow grows closer to Ged, and Ged in some metaphorical sense falls beneath the shadow, right? To borrow that metaphor and imagery from the Lord of the Rings again, as the shadow extends out across all of Earthsea, and Ged feels himself bound and limited by it, as he feels himself cut off from warmth and hope and possibility. So the shadow becomes stronger. It's not just the proximity, but it is the proximity that enkindles within Ged this fear, this uncertainty, or I suppose more accurately, removes from Ged the opposite of those things, right? That his uncertainty, again, we're kind of involved in an interesting linguistic game here. Uncertainty, not the opposite of certainty, but the absence of certainty. Fear, not the opposite of courage, but the absence of courage. Here, Ged is becoming less, he is becoming reduced, and we're going to see this crystallize beautifully around Ged right at the end of the following chapter. But Ged is becoming, or I guess at the midpoint of the following chapter, a weird chapter break in chapter 7, that we don't get a chapter break between his time with Surette in Oskel and then his return to Gaunt, the flight of the hawk, right? We don't get a chapter break there, even though we might assume that there would be one in another book. That absence of a chapter break gives the whole 7th chapter of this book a sense of mythic weight and significance, because the whole story has to be taken in one piece. We don't get that natural interregnum between, you know, his time in Oskel and his return to Gaunt, which, as I say, another writer, I won't say a lesser writer, another writer might be tempted to give us. So all of this is to say that Ged is being reduced, that he is being defined by the absence of these things which make him, which make human beings, agency and hope and a kind of living ferocity, you know, a passion for experience and for life and for connection and for the doing of, well, I was going to say the doing of good, but really just the doing of things, really just that action and activity idea, right? These things are now being taken from Ged, or Ged, more accurately, is losing these things under the influence of the shadow. And in that absence, the shadow itself is being defined. So we're not sure yet of the nature of the shadow, but we're certainly getting the idea that Ged and the shadow are interdependent, that they are entwined. It isn't just the case that the shadow is feeding off of Ged. The shadow is, in a sense, taking these things, but isn't taking these things directly from Ged, right? The shadow is not pulling from Ged his, let's just say, courage. Just to look at one of the virtues that is being challenged in Ged's consciousness right now. The shadow is not feeding off the courage of Ged, but the presence of the shadow is leading to the absence of courage, which is leading to the strengthening of the shadow's essence, right? We've got this interesting kind of duality between these figures. Joseph says, I can't believe Ged thought he would be able to sail to Roke. Hasn't he read Roke School, a history? I love the idea of there being just these expanded texts that he can refer to. Of course, we get a number of expanded texts, not just in this book, but in the rest of the series too. Why did Ged think that he could go to Roke? I guess it was hope, right? I guess he believed that he could take shelter there again. And we're kind of reminded of the words of the Archmage. We talked about this last time before Ged went to take the job at Low Torning back out in the 90 Isles. He was told by the Archmage, you can't leave. You absolutely have to stay here because this is the only place that you're safe. But then the people of Low Torning come to Roke and say, well, we need a wizard, actually. And the Archmage thinks, oh, well, Ged, he can go to Low Torning. He can protect that village community, that cluster of villages across the islands there. He can go there and gather his strength and practice his craft and become strong enough to fight the shadow outside of the protection of Roke, which is the only thing that is keeping him safe. What is that impulse? Why does Ged go out there? And of course, we must remember that when Ged is offered the job to go to Low Torning, he is told there will be no fame, there will be no wealth, no celebrity here, but also no risk. And that absence of risk is treated like it's a negative thing, right? Well, sure, you're going to go here. There's not going to be any, celebrity here. You're not going to become a wealthy man from working for these people, and you're not going to be in danger. So really there's nothing to compel you to take the job at Low Turning except for your desire to serve these people, to serve the people of the 90 Isles. What is Ged's path here? What is Ged's route here? Well, in fact, no, I was going to get into that. You know what? Let's take a beat. Let's take a breath. Let's take a pause, and we'll circle back around to that in just a little while when we have a little more information. So this is Ged's current situation. He can't move. He doesn't know what to do. So he decides to flee. He decides to go north. Under advice, he decides to go north to Oskill. And when he gets his berth on the boat, acting as an oarsman, a rower on this boat, because they don't need a wizard. His wizard staff here does not get him the passage that it ordinarily would. So laying his staff and his bag of books under the rower's bench, Ged became for 10 bitter days of winter an oarsman of that northern ship. They left Ormy at daybreak, and that day Ged thought he could never keep up his work. His left arm was somewhat lamed by the old wounds in his shoulder, and all his rowing in the channels about Low Turning had not trained him for the relentless pull and pull and pull at the long galley oar to the beat of the drum. Each stint at the oars was of 2 or 3 hours. Then a second shift of oarsmen took the benches. But the time of rest seemed only long enough for all Ged's muscles to stiffen, and then it was back to the oars. And the second day of it was worse. But after that, he hardened to the labour and got on well enough. There was no such comradeship among this crew as he had found aboard Shadow when he first went to Roke. The crewmen of Andradian and Gonta's ships are partners in the trade, working together for a common profit, whereas traders of Oskill use slaves and bondsmen or hire men to row, paying them with small coins of gold. Gold is a great thing in Oskill, but it is not a source of good fellowship there, or amongst the dragons who also prize it highly. Since half of this crew were bondsmen forced to work, the ship's officers were slave masters and harsh ones. They never laid their whips on the back of an oarsman who worked for pay or passage, but there will not be much friendliness in a crew of whom some are whipped and others are not. Ged's fellows said little to one another and less to him. They were mostly men from Oskill, speaking not the Hardic tongue of the archipelago, but a dialect of their own, and they were dour men, pale-skinned with black drooping moustaches and lank hair. Keleb, the Red One, was Ged's name among them. Though they knew he was a wizard, they showed him no regard, but rather a kind of cautious spitefulness. And he himself was in no mood for making friends. Even on his bench, caught up in the mighty rhythm of the rowing, one oarsman among 60 in a ship racing over void grey seas, he felt himself exposed, defenseless. When they came into strange ports at nightfall and he rolled himself in his cloak to sleep, weary as he was, he would dream, wake, dream again, evil dreams that he could not recall waking, though they seemed to hang about the ship and the men of the ship, so that he mistrusted each one of them. Well, let's talk a little about Oskill first. We're going to talk about the influence of the Shadow and how it has served to further separate Ged from the men of his fellowship, the men of his company here. But let's talk about Oskill first, this grim and bitter land to the north that does not speak the Hardic tongue, but rather their own language, that it is not of the archipelago for as much as it is of Earthsea, that it is separate and preoccupied with these small coins of gold. And just in case we weren't going to make this connection, just in case we weren't the careful readers that we clearly are, Le Guin goes to the trouble of laying out the point of comparison here. Remember, we just had the confrontation with the Dragon of Pendor, right? With the ancient dragon Yavad, who says to Ged, what is with men these days? What happened to the greed of men? Gold was highly prized back in the day. The gems of my hoard, I will give you the 9 gems of my hoard if you just leave, if you just depart now and leave me to my ways. What happened to the greed of man? Well, it turns out that the greed of man still endures in Oskill, that these small golden coins, beloved of the men of Oskill and beloved of dragons, are powerful trinkets themselves. And obviously, Le Guin draws a powerful comparison here between the domination of the slave masters, the owners of the ship, the I suppose, officer class aboard the ship, and the actual slaves, the actual bondsmen, you know, those who are indentured to servitude aboard the ship, and those who are paid to be there. Now, yes, it is true that the masters of the ship do not lift their whips against the backs of those who are being paid to row, because they don't need to. The obedience of a slave must be commanded. The obedience of a bondsman must be commanded through the application of fear, through the specific application of the whip, but the more general application of fear. But these men who have taken the small golden coins of Oskill for their efforts, for their service here, they don't need the whip because they are already bound by the coin. They are already bound by the greed and the desire for more of this money. They don't need to be threatened. They are in a sense, threatening themselves. They have subjugated themselves willingly. They don't need to be subjugated by force. So before we ever get to Oskill, we're already fearful of it. We're already skeptical of it. We're already looking at Oskill as a separate and distinct culture, which does not sit comfortably alongside the much more harmonious cultures that we've experienced throughout the archipelago so far. The Androdean ships and the Gontish ships. You know, we've seen fellowship aboard ships. Ged here himself contrasts his experience here with the Shadow. There's no camaraderie on board. There's no unity here. The men on Gontish ships are all empowered. They are a part of the endeavor. They are working together for positive mutual gain, right? They are investors in the ship, if you like, to use a particularly and inappropriately modern terminology. But that is not the case with Oskill. In Oskill, there is still a hard dividing line between those who will profit from this venture and those who are undertaking this venture for other reasons. And even those oarsmen who are being paid, they are not sharing in the profit of the venture. They are not empowered by that transaction. They are limited by it, bound by it. Let's see here in the chat. Lily's calling out the cold. Yeah, Rayla Lynn begins this. The shadow and mention of cold wounds too. It definitely reminds me of Frodo. Yes, a strong connection back to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. And the use of cold is only going to become more pronounced by the time that we get into chapter 7. The cold is everywhere. It is constant, and it is so much more than just a geographical or climactic separation between Ged's experience and where he currently is. It's not just this point of distinction between where he is comfortable and where he is uncomfortable. It does seem to resonate deeper than that. The stones themselves are cold. The air itself is cold. The land itself is cold. And that cold seeps into Ged. Again, the absence of light and life and fire. Right? We've seen that contrast drawn before, back with the Archmage on Roke. So let's take a look here at the end. Though they knew he was a wizard, they showed him no regard, but rather a kind of cautious spitefulness. And he himself was in no mood for making friends. Even on his bench, caught up in the mighty rhythm of the rowing, one oarsman among 60 in a ship racing over void grey seas, he felt himself exposed and defenseless. So even in the company of 59 other oarsmen here, even as they are literally working together to propel this great ship across these void gray seas, void gray here, I think, used to draw the distinction between the emptiness of the world around the ship and the relative heat and vibrancy of the ship itself, the drumbeat and the exertion and the motion and the movement here aboard the ship. But that itself is, and you'll note too, this idea of void gray seas, one of the very few times in the book when the sea is presented as, well, not even unfriendly, I suppose, but merely apathetic. You know, there's no sense in which, I was just talking about, the Oskillian crew here being not unified around a common purpose the way that the Gontish ships are, or the Androdean ships are, or the Androdean and Gontish crews, I suppose. They're not unified around a common purpose. They're not unified with each other, but they also appear not to be unified with the sea. They're not working with the wind. They're not working with the natural motion of the world. They're not working with the natural powers embedded in Earthsea that arise from Earthsea itself. No, they stand in opposition to that. They're rowing. They have these banks of oarsmen driving their ship forward, heedless of the wind, heedless of the sea. It doesn't matter what is happening in the natural world. They are apart. But even in that tight-knit community, which you would expect from everything in the narration that we get here, you would expect the ship to be somewhat unified. Hey, it's a grim, dark world out there, but we are alive and vibrant and moving. We are doing this thing. There still isn't unity among the crew for the reasons which we discussed previously, and because of Ged's isolation. He is mistrustful. He is distrustful. He has no interest in making friends, no mood for making friends. He felt himself exposed and defenseless. When they came into strange ports at nightfall and he rolled himself in his cloak to sleep, weary as he was, he would dream and wake and dream again, but evil dreams that he could not recall waking. So he knows that the dreams are bad. He knows that the dreams are of evil aspect, but he can't remember the specifics, which makes him fearful of literally everything. He doesn't know that the shadow is, thanks to some more conventional prophetic dream, he doesn't know that the shadow has infiltrated the crew, that the shadow has even potentially, maybe taken the form of someone, has enrobed itself in flesh. It has transformed some member of this crew, some member of this community into a Gebeth. We don't know that has happened. Ged doesn't know that has happened, but he's fearful of everything. So again, the shadow here, the influence of the shadow, both direct and indirect, doesn't leech from Ged specific power or specific strength, doesn't bind within Ged specific power or specific strength, but rather takes from him the opposite, right? It creates a productive space for the shadow by removing those barriers which stand against that space. It takes his hope so that it can thrive in the hopelessness. It takes his courage so that it can thrive in his fear. These are the actions of the shadow. But you'll note that Ged here is complicit. Is complicit too strong a word? I mean, he is fulfilling his role. He's doing exactly as the shadow demands of him. He's not going out to, he's not returning to Gaunt, for example, to go see a Guin. He's not pursuing Astariel. He's not going out to find Vetch out on his island. He's not turning to friendship and camaraderie. He even left behind the celebratory fires of Low Torning to isolate himself once again in order to protect the world, of course, in order to protect himself. We'll get an accounting of his rationale once we get to Surratt in just a few slides' time. But here he is isolated. It is all very, very bad. This is the point at which we meet Skior, the Oscilian freeman. So he actually is a member of the crew, right? He is specifically not a bondsman. He is not a slave on the ship. He is a freeman. Oh, I should say too, Keleb, the Red One, was Ged's name. Among them, another name for Ged, which would be significant anyway, but is all the more significant because of the power of names. Here, Ged has been deprived even of his name of Sparrowhawk, right? He's not even Sparrowhawk here because now there are songs that are sung about Sparrowhawk. And true, no one has heard those songs here. No one among this crew has heard the song of Sparrowhawk. No one has heard of his deed on Pandor. That just hasn't happened yet. But the name Sparrowhawk still carries with it, I think, some weight. It still carries with it some agency, if for no one else than Sparrowhawk himself, right? He is going to hear his name and say, yes, I am Sparrowhawk. I am the one who faced down the elder dragon Yavowed and prevented him from crossing the ocean back to the 90 Isles. I bound him by his name. I did that thing. I saved those people. He doesn't even get that. Now he is simply Keleb, the Red One. And then we get that beat when we meet Skior, which I didn't pull for a slide because it's very brief, but he gets this beat with Skior where Skior confronts him and says, are you slave or oathbreaker, Keleb? To which Ged replies, neither. Why no knife then? Afraid to fight? Said the man, jeering. No. Your little dog fight for you? Otuk, said another who listened. No dog, that is Otuk. And he said something in Oscilian that made Skior scowl and turn away. And at that moment, Ged sees the shifting in his features. He sees this late 90s Terminator 2 morphing effect on the features of Skior, as for a moment he appears to be someone else, and then they reset. And perhaps it was just a trick of the light, perhaps it was nothing terribly significant, but that is enough for us to know that actually Skior is, at this point, well, what? Inhabited by the shadow? Dominated by the shadow? Has been killed and effectively replaced by the shadow? Whatever the process of becoming a Gebeth is, it has happened to Skior. But it's interesting that even then we're drawing this connection back to Skior as a regular Oscilian freeman, right? Let me see here. The Lord of the Ring read, says C-Star, makes me hear Keleb red and think of Keleb with a C, meaning silver. Yes, of Celeborn, for example. Yes, a good solid Sindarin word being put to poor usage here, even if the spelling has changed. Yeah. Eve says that always makes me think of the Fallen. Oh, yes. Okay, good. Scrolling back here, I've missed some things. Yes, Alexis puts her finger on it perfectly. This is beautiful. The fact that, talking of the oarsmen, the fact that they are literally moving at the same time but still aren't able to make a connection is really interesting. Yes, this is exactly it. They are actually unified, physically unified, right? By the beat of the drum, they all move together and they produce a great effect by that movement together. But as people, as individuals, they separate from that unity and isolate themselves again. That's all part of it. That each stint at the oars was of 2 or 3 hours, and then a second shift of oarsmen took the benches. But the time of rest seemed only long enough for Ged's muscles to stiffen, and then it was back to the oars. Seemed time enough for Ged's muscles to stiffen. Presumably he eats by himself, sleeps when he can by himself, doesn't connect with the other oarsmen, and they themselves do not connect with each other. Yeah, good. Okay. Let's keep moving on. So we get to Well, gosh, we get to Oskill, and it turns out that, hey, Skier is going to the court of Terranon as well. Isn't that convenient? Let's walk far from the sea. Let's walk into the embrace of the earth, which is going to become very significant later. Then it turns out, of course, that Skior has been taken by the shadow. The otak stirred in his pocket with a little vague fear that woke and stirred in his mind. He forced himself to speak. Darkness comes, and snow. How far, Skior? After a pause, the other answered without turning. Not far. But his voice sounded not like a man's voice, but like a beast, hoarse and lipless, that tries to speak. Ged stopped. All around stretched empty hills in the late dusk light. Sparse snow whirled a little falling. Skior, he said, and the other halted and turned. There was no face under the peaked hood. Before Ged could speak spell or summon power, the Gebeth spoke, saying in its hoarse voice, Ged. Then the young man could work no transformation, but was locked in his true being and must face the Gebeth thus defenseless. Nor could he summon any help in this alien land where nothing and no one was known to him and would come at his call. He stood alone with nothing between him and his enemy but the staff of yew wood in his right hand. The thing that had devoured Skior's mind and possessed his flesh made this body take a step toward Ged, and the arms came groping out towards him. A rage of horror filled Ged, and he swung up and brought down his staff, whistling on the hood that hid the shadow face. Hood and cloak collapsed nearly down to the ground under the fierce blow, as if there was nothing in them but wind, and then writhing and flapping stood up again. The body of a Gebeth has been drained of true substance into something like a shell or a vapor in the form of a man, an unreal flesh clothing the shadow which is real. So jerking and billowing as if blown on the wind, the shadow spread its arms and came at Ged, trying to get hold of him as he held him on Roke Knoll, and if it did, it would cast aside the husk of Skior and enter into Ged, devouring him out from within, owning him, which was its whole desire. Ged struck at it again with his heavy smoking staff, beating it off, but it came again, and he struck again, and then dropped the staff that blazed and smoldered, burning his hand. He backed away, then all at once turned and ran. So here we are, far from the sea, cast out in this desert of land, desert of earth. The otik stirs in his pocket, and we get the connection once again between the otik and something within Ged, right? The otik is never taken as a familiar, right? He speaks the otik's name, Hoeg. He speaks the otik's name and takes it as a pet. And there's never a beat in the story where we say, oh, yes, and thus was this wizard united with his familiar. But this is in many ways absolutely reminiscent of the tradition of familiars in fairy tale and in folklore. The otik is representative of Ged. And we get this here. The otik stirred in his pocket, and a little vague fear also woke and stirred in his mind. The contrast there, or not the contrast, but the comparison there, the unification of those two disparate ideas, the creature stirs in his pocket and the fear stirs in his mind, they are connected. The fact that we use the word stirred for both shows that they are connected. He forced himself to speak. Darkness comes in snow. How far? Skior. And this is where we get our confrontation. Let's look, though, at what specifically happens, because Ged is about to lose his power, right? He's about to be rendered much less than he after passing out again, as is Ged's way. You know, we're 6 chapters in. This is the 6th chapter of the book. He's about to pass out for the 4th time. The 4th time in this book, he's just going to pass out and wake unknowing, just wake in a new environment and see what the world has in store for him. It's fine. Again, you know, we can criticize the book for relying perhaps a little too heavily on that trope, but it is at least consistent as we move through. But let's pay attention to what actually happens. Before Ged could speak or summon power, the Gebeth spoke, saying in its hoarse voice, Ged. Then the young man could work no transformation. So as a consequence of the Gebeth of the shadow of Skior saying Ged's true name, he is locked in his true being, okay? Then the young man could work no transformation, but was locked in his true being and must face the Gebeth, thus defenseless. Not utterly defenseless, thus defenseless. This is why Ged cannot, or this is one of the 2 reasons that Ged cannot take action against the shadow at this point. He is bound in his true form and cannot himself transform, right? By speaking his true name, the shadow has pinned him, if you like a butterfly to a corkboard. He has pinned and defined Ged. And of course, how great is it that this person, this creature, that this individual can be defined by his name, can be limited by his name, right? In the silence, the word, in the silence of possibility, in the silence of magic and spellcraft, in this wide open landscape, Ged has just been skewered by the one thing that is uniquely his name. Now he cannot transform, thanks to the speaking of his name. But that's not the whole problem. Nor could he summon any help in this alien land where nothing and no one was known to him and would come at his call. So the shadow has not taken away his spellcasting ability. He can't summon the rocks to aid him or call down a bird from the sky to aid him because he just doesn't know their names. He's now just too far from his frame of reference, which gives a really interesting perspective on what we were talking about last time. Actually, I think in the previous session, 2 sessions ago now, where we were talking about, the limits upon wizardry, when we have that conversation with the Master Namer back on Roke. And he said, yeah, no one can command the sea because the sea doesn't have one name, or rather the sea does have one name, but it is one name for the entire sea, except all the parts of the sea that have specific names. And by the way, the vast majority of the sea has a specific name. So no one can take world-changing action. No wizard can take world-changing action because no wizard can know enough of the names. No wizard can be powerful enough in knowledge to exert that kind of mastery over the entirety of Earthsea. And now we see another wrinkle on this, that wizards are necessarily connected to their home environment. Ged can command Roke. He can command Gaunt to a certain extent. He can command Lotorning, presumably, to a certain extent. But he can't command this place. This place is so far out of his experience that he knows none of the names. But the important thing here to understand is that the shadow is not limiting him. The shadow has not bound his spellcasting ability. The shadow has only bound his ability to transform. It hasn't taken away his magic. That's not quite what we're doing. Then we get the accounting of the Gebeth. The thing that had devoured Skior's mind and possessed his flesh made the body take a step toward Ged. So it made the body. Even now we're getting the sense that there is a disconnection between the body of Skior and the essence, the substance, the being of the shadow, if you like. So it has devoured Skior's mind. It now inhabits his body, but the body is not what it was. Hood and cloak collapsed down nearly to the ground under that fierce blow as if there was nothing in them but wind, and then writhing and flapping stood up again. The body of a Gebeth, and this is one of those beats in which Ursula K. Le Guin pulls the narrative voice way back. She absolutely modulates her delivery here, right? We're getting action, action, action. We're really close to Ged. We're really in the present moment. This is terrifying. This is all really bad. A rage of horror filled Ged, and he swung and brought down his staff, whistling on the hood, right? So we're really close to Ged, and then we take that step back and we get the documentary account. The body of a Gebeth, FYI, has been drained of true substance and is something like a shell or a vapor in the form of a man, an unreal flesh clothing the shadow which is real. Just in case you're wondering. That's the intrusion of the narrative voice here. So that's what a Gebeth is. The body of a Gebeth has been drained of true substance and is something like a shell or a vapor in the form of a man. There is a profound difference between the shell and the vapor, but you remember when Ged first... okay, let me revise that sentence. You remember when Ged summoned for the second time the shadow on Roke Knoll, and we had that beat of it being on top of him and kind of clawing at him, growing and shrinking simultaneously, that there was something unearthly, something unsettling about that unity of two opposed ideas. How can it be both growing and shrinking at the same time, but somehow it is this kind of Lovecraftian, non-Euclidean thing that is going on here, this otherworldly essence of the shadow. Well, it seems to me that we get that here too. Something like a shell or a vapor. Those are two very different ideas, actually. Like a shell and a vapor, pretty much as different from one another as it is possible to be. Is it a gas, or is it something, not just a solid, not just, a frame of the man, not just the skeleton of the man, but a shell, something that is supposed to be armored and kind of by definition more solid than it would otherwise be. Something like a shell or a vapor in the form of a man, an unreal flesh clothing the shadow, which is real. So the shadow has now not taken over Skior's body as much as it has taken Skior's form. It's not inhabiting him, it would seem, in quite the way that we would expect. It's not possession, The body itself has been transformed. So we may as well say that Skior has in fact been killed outright, and now the shadow just looks like him. Let me see here, looking at the chat, which is running on without me. I know I'm covering a lot of slides tonight, but still, yes. Oh, as Lily says, neither shell nor vapor are fully solid, though. A shell on its own is hollow and easily broken. Yes. And so Sundari says, or a fragile and hollow eggshell. Yes. And Nikki says, shell would be like the imitation of a man, wouldn't it? Yes. I mean, shell certainly would give us a more physical form. I mean, that's the opposition, right? Shell or vapor, like physical form or the absence of physical form, like matter or gas or solid or gas. What is happening here? That's fair, I think. But yeah, still kind of opposed there. Let me scroll back through. Gosh, you guys have been so chatty tonight. Yes, I feel for Gin Fizz, who says trying to do this session on my phone is brutal. Yes, I know. I can only imagine this on a small screen with chat racing on ahead. You guys are all brilliant and wonderfully, wonderfully insightful. Thank you so much for contributing your thoughts, even if I'm not keeping up with them as well as I should. I do go back and read everything for what it's worth. Now that we're doing this on Crowdcast, I can actually go back and read everything that is discussed. And I know that many of you will be moved to send me your thoughts and observations and perspectives via Twitter or via email in the days ahead. Thank you so much for that. I'm still dreadfully, dreadfully behind on answering email, but I do read everything, so thank you for that. Good. Okay, so this is the reveal of Skior's true form. Ged, at the end of this, runs. He runs and he runs. He runs up a hill, which is calling back to his experience with the shadow in the Sunless Realm when he goes after... I'm forgetting the kid's name. Eothe, something like that. Pekvari's son, I suppose. So he runs up a hill there too, so we're kind of echoing those two experiences. And then right before he passes out, Ged makes it through a door and into a light and falls into his coma, his unconscious state, his now habitual unconscious state, and we move into chapter 7, The Hawk's Flight. Ged woke, and for a long time he lay, aware only that it was pleasant to wake, for he had not expected to wake again, and very pleasant to see light, the large plain light of day all about him. He felt as if he were floating on that light, or drifting in a boat on very quiet waters. At last he made out that he was in a bed, but no such bed as he had ever slept in. It was set up on a frame held by 4 tall carven legs, and the mattresses were great silk sacks of down, which was why he thought he was floating. And over it all a crimson canopy hung to keep out the draughts. On 2 sides the curtain was tied back, and Ged looked out at a room with walls of stone and floor of stone. Through 3 high windows he saw the moorland, bare and brown, snow-patched here and there in the mild sunlight of winter. The room must be high above the ground, for it looked a great way over the land. A coverlet of down-filled satin slid aside as Ged sat up, and he saw himself clothed in a tunic of silver and cloth of silver like a lord, and cloth of silver like a lord. On a chair beside the bed, boots of glove leather and a cloak lined with Palawi fur were laid ready for him. He sat a while, calm and dull as one under an enchantment, and then stood up, reaching for his staff. But he had no staff. His right hand, though it had been salved and bound, was burned on palm and fingers. Now he felt the pain of it and the soreness of all his body. So the shadow has burned up his staff, or rather, his staff has been consumed by the assault upon the shadow, and it has burned his right hand. Now he is wounded gravely, and though it has been salved and bound, it still hurts. And the absence of the staff hurts just as much. So here he wakes in opulent surroundings, right? We don't necessarily need to know the specifics here to recognize that these are opulent surroundings. And they're opulent surroundings not just to our eyes, but specifically to Ged's eyes, the things that he knows, right? So this bed is incredibly comfortable. Okay, we can imagine a comfortable bed. And then he looks out through the canopy and sees walls of stone and floor of stone. Holy smokes. This is not like the crude shacks that I'm used to back at 10 Alders. This is not like, a Guin's little rustic cabin at Rayalby. This is not even like the more cathedral-like accommodations on Roke. This certainly isn't like my little shack on Low Torning. This is something very different. This is something alien to my experience. The stone here also emphasizes the cold, emphasizing Ged's warmth here. The idea that he is wrapped in this coverlet, the idea that the bed is so warm and comfortable that the canopy is hung to keep out the drafts. Beyond, we get cold. We get this chill that pervades everything in this chapter. So this is our introduction to chapter 7, The Hawk's Flight. As I say, a chapter of 2 parts, really. We get Surratt up front. We get the whole encounter with the Terranon and all that flows forth from that. Then we get the flight. We get both the metaphorical in the Gandalfian sense, flight, and then we get the literal in the hawkish sense, flight, and then we get a Guin at the end of the chapter. This chapter, I said before, I think, that this chapter and chapter 5, The Dragon of Pandora and The Hawk's Flight, stand apart for me from the rest of the book, in that they're absolutely consistent parts of the narrative, of course, but both of these chapters read to me as though they could be stories of myth. They could be ancient stories. This could pretty much be a fairy tale, be a fable almost on its own terms. You could kind of cut chapter 7 and take it out and have that simply be a story. And the same is true to a certain degree of chapter 5 too. And that, I think, is intentional within the frame of this narration. I think that the narrative voice, the narrative conceit here, that this is a document that has survived from the time of Ged, and that we get this kind of intertextuality as we move in and out of Ged's POV and Ged's awareness in the same kind of temporal frame. You know, here's the thing that's happening to Ged, and it's super urgent, and we're right there. But also let it be known that no dragons have come to Gaunt in 500 years, or whatever the line is that we get about dragons coming to Gaunt, which is why Ged is so excited to go out to the 90 Isles and think about the dragons of Pandor. That's kind of, that documentarian aspect to the narrative voice is crucial, is beautiful, and absolutely does that thing that good narration does, which is teaches us how to understand the tone and the mode of this story. It's not just about the action. It's not just about the plot or the characterization or, you know, the literal interpretation of what happens to Ged. Here, it's what kind of story is this? Le Guin's mastery over that voice leaves us in no doubt as to the kind of story. You know, it's different in the first few chapters. The first chapter can be any farm boy hero origin story from a contemporary fantasy novel, though we must remember that Le Guin wrote this in 67 and 68, which means that she preempted that movement pretty comprehensively, actually tying back, of course, to the medieval, you know, Arthurian and quasi-Arthurian tradition of the farm boy hero, the humble hero who discovers that he is, in fact, exceptional, both by dint of birth and by dint of effort. She's absolutely tying back to that, as fantasy fiction always has, but she's also preempting what would become, God, just a ubiquitous trope through the 70s and 80s in fantasy fiction, in which you can still find today, you know, and which leads us all the way up to Harry Potter, in fact. Though I suppose, yeah, the circumstances of Harry's birth actually separate him a little bit, but many of the mechanics are the same. The underlying intent is a little different, but the way that the story is told is evocative of those fantasy tropes. Not necessarily cliches, but certainly fantasy tropes. So Le Guin is teaching us how to read this story, and when we're reading chapter 7, we are given a different perspective on Ged, on Earthsea, on the nature of good and evil. We must get to the final point here, where we're looking at the actual confrontation between Surette and Ged. Let's take a look at the chat. First, though, C-Star says, I want a canopy bed very much. Oh, and Jen replies, canopy beds are beautiful, but I've torn down more than a few. One gets tangled at the most inopportune moments. You need a certain spatial awareness and also a robustly constructed canopy bed, I would say. Yeah, I'm 6'4". I've always felt, you know, that the canopy beds could be claustrophobic. You know, I have trouble with beds anyway. I've never slept in a bed, you guys, where my feet haven't been hanging off the end. That's just a truth of my life. That's just a fact of my existence. So, you know, I'm not sure that I need all those drapes hanging down, but, you know, aesthetically, they kind of do the trick. They kind of do the trick. Oh, Father John has a great comparison here. Roke reminds me of my island monastic foundations of I'm sorry, I just scrolled, like Iona and Lindisfarne. Yes, absolutely. The idea of the sequestered monastic abbey-like school absolutely ties back to the medieval tradition, right? To the Dark Age tradition. We call the Dark Age with a great sense of smug superiority, a kind of Victorian smug superiority here, which was absolutely decried by writers, including J.R.R. Tolkien, you know, by medievalists, including J.R.R. Tolkien. We call the Dark Ages because they were a time of great ignorance, and that is absolutely untrue. There are outposts, there are cities on the hill throughout the medieval period, which are incredibly progressive, incredibly learned, and dedicated to not just the preservation of actual knowledge, but the accumulation of knowledge and the investigation of the natural world. You know, simultaneously with the Dark Ages being a period of intellectual regression in, you know, the kind of popular conception of that period. At the same time as that was happening, we were getting the origins of natural philosophy. We were getting the origins of actual science. We were getting the first kind of taxonomic impulses. People were going out into the world and categorizing everything. You know, scholars of the medieval period, scholars throughout the Dark Ages, loved classifying and building taxonomies of things, of insects and of leaves and of animals and of people and of everything that they could get their hands on. This is the origin of what would become the hobby, the dalliance of the gentleman philosopher later in you know, the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. So yes, absolutely. This monastic tradition speaks very powerfully to this idea of the preservation of knowledge, but also the expansion of knowledge. But it is a preservation and expansion of knowledge which is kind of anchored in a sense of community, right? It is anchored in not just the specific building, but the specific group of people. That people here are gathered for are gathered in fellowship, that are gathered in like purpose, in aligned purpose. And in the monastic tradition, of course, that comes from the unifying influence there of their faith. They're there directly because they believe the same thing. They literally believe the same thing. So they're facing in the same direction and moving in the same direction. And that gives this a kind of a powerful unity, but also a kind of, when taken in aggregate, of course, across the entirety of Western Europe at the time, a kind of interesting fractionalism, a kind of interesting kind of splintered aspect when we're looking at the evolution of popular ideas. Anyway, that perhaps is for a history podcast, which I know that Becca Eller is far more able to give you all than I can. If you're not listening to Becca's podcast, you should definitely remedy that. Let me see here. As I moved on, we're just talking a lot about bads here. Jin says, Dan getting dragged by Alistair from my poor spatial awareness. Listen, there was a lot going on when those canopies were torn down. Jin, I have no doubt of that whatsoever. I'm just, that certainly wasn't to criticize your sense of spatial awareness, but rather to open a dialogue and an open question mark over my own sense of spatial awareness and one's spatial awareness in general. You, I'm sure, are a paragon of the spatially aware. Let's keep going. Yes. Anyone thinking the Dark Ages should read Bede? Yes, absolutely, Father John. Good. This will be a conversation that we will have at other points in the future. In fact, this will be a conversation that we will have in part when we're discussing Goblet of Fire, I think. Because while we're talking about that, and I'm not quite putting my finger on the right word here. I'm tempted to go to like fractional or factionalized. I want something in that kind of splintered sense, but I'm not quite there. But when we're talking about that monastic tradition in Western Europe during the Dark Ages, up to the Enlightenment, basically, that is certainly going to be brought to mind by the addition into the Harry Potter universe of actual wizarding schools, of other actual wizarding schools. So we'll get an opportunity to talk about that a little bit when we get to Goblet of Fire. Okay, let me catch up here. Yes, Becca's advertising her podcast, Retold, a history podcast. It's very, very good. Becca is incredibly smart and the show is excellent. So I urge you all to get your learning on and go catch up with Becca's podcast. All right, let's keep moving on. We need to talk about, a woman. This is a woman. I don't know how many of you recognized this character when she showed up, but given that we have had, very few female characters who've actually been given lines of dialogue in this book so far, and given that we've only had one character who prior to Ged's voyage was identified as Oscillian or half Oscillian, this jumped out to me immediately. I remember thinking this the first time that I read the book. Oh my God, how cool. We brought back that girl from the meadow back at Ray Abbey. It's going to be a while before we get the reveal, which I think is actually playing very fair with Ged's sense of awareness. The reader here throughout the first part of this chapter, very, very close to Ged, very surprisingly close to Ged and his experience. Actually, here we go. A little bell rang somewhere far away. The second bell rang in a sweet jangle just outside the room. A door opened behind him across the room, and a woman came in. "Welcome, Sparrowhawk," she said, smiling. She was young and tall, dressed in white and silver, with a net of silver crowning her hair that fell straight down like a fall of black water. Stiffly, Ged bowed. "You don't remember me, I think." "Remember you, lady." He had never seen a beautiful woman dressed to match her beauty but once in his life, that lady of O who had come with her lord to the Sun Return Festival at Roke. She had been like a slight, bright candle flame, but this woman was like the white new moon. "I thought you would not," she said, smiling, "but forgetful as you may be, you're welcome here as an old friend." "What place is this?" Ged asked, still stiff and slow-tongued. He found it hard to speak to her and hard to look away from her. The princely clothes he wore were strange to him. The stones he stood on were unfamiliar. The very air he breathed was alien. He was not himself, not the self he had been. "This keep is called the Court of the Terranon. My lord, who is called Benderesk, is the sovereign of this land at the edge of the Kexmet moors north of the mountains of Oz, and keeper of the precious stone called Terranon. As for myself, here in Oskill, they call me Surret, silver in their language, and you, I know, are sometimes called Sparrowhawk, and were made wizard in the Isle of the Wise." Ged looked down at his burned hand and said presently, "I do not know what I am. I had power once. I have lost it, I think." One of the things that Rayla Lynn is calling out, he literally describes her in the exact same way when they met. Yes, it's beautiful. The echo, the long black hair, the white, the connection of white, right? Remember how she stood in her white dress with the white flowers clustered around her, right? White upon white, and then we get the straight dark hair falling. She was young and tall, dressed in white and silver, with a net of silver crowning her hair that fell straight down like a fall of black water. Yeah, we've had this before. We know who this is. We've had this character show up before. But there's more than that happening here. This isn't just a recapitulation of a character who showed up earlier in the book. This isn't just Ursula K. Le Guin kind of demonstrating a kind of narrative conservation, right? Have you heard of this idea of the narrative conservation of detail? The idea that if a character is introduced, then if any element is introduced to a story, that element must be made to serve as many purposes as it reasonably can. That is to say that if you can have one character fulfilling 4 different purposes within your story, then you should. You should not introduce 4 different characters if one character can do the work of those 4 without breaking your reader's immersion in the fiction. This is because every single added detail that crops up in your story is a brick in the backpack of your reader, is a thing that your reader has to remember, is another point of connection, another point of interface, another detail to be maintained by your reader's investment of belief. So this is not, though, Ursula K. Le Guin simply being a good and obedient novel writer and practicing in accordance with the conservation of narrative detail here. This is far more important than that, because what we're doing is transitioning into fairy. We're in a different realm now, and it's not just a different realm because it is in the north. It is fundamentally different, and it's not quite fairy the way that fairy works in fairy tales, or the way that fairy works in Tolkien, or the way that fairy works in, C.S. Lewis. This isn't quite Narnia. This isn't quite another world in that sense, but it is alien, and we get a couple of indications of that. We get some classical references here to Seret, as I'm alternating my pronunciation, my stress pattern there. I don't know whether I prefer Seret or Seret. I'm not sure quite where. I think I prefer Seret, but still, my tongue sometimes decides, no, let's try the other one. No, I like that less. We'll go back to Seret in due course. This isn't just a fiction contained within Earthsea. There are lines of connection coming out from this scene in particular out to the folkloric tradition of Western Europe, out to fairy tales in general. A little bell rang somewhere far away. A second bell rang in a sweet jangle just outside the room. A door opened behind him and a woman came in. That association between bells and the feminine presence, the bells oftentimes herald the coming of elves, the coming of fairies, right? That is a tradition that you can find in Peter Pan, in ancient folklore, in fairy tales. You can go back to ancient Greece and you can find connections between bells and supernatural forces, supernatural figures, right? So the ringing of a bell here, this is the acknowledgement that we are in a different world, and that a fairy, if you like, an elf is coming into our presence here. She was young and tall, dressed in white and silver, with a net of silver crowning her hair. So we're getting the whole, again, white and silver, right? These are ethereal colors. These are colors which are oftentimes associated with elves and elvendom, with the realm of fairy. And once again, they're being brought out here. And then, of course, the detail that this woman, Seret, knows Ged, and he doesn't know her. This is a point of unearthly connection again. And of course, even if he remembered her, we would just be calling back to that first transition to fairy that we got with Ged in the high meadow. Remember, he goes out to the high meadow. He finds the herbs. He thinks, this is great. I'm going to come back tomorrow and get more of these. And when he returns, she's there. She's not there by accident the first day that he goes there. And I don't believe for a second that she's there by accident the second day that he goes there. She knows, or her mother knows, if we're following a Guin's conspiracy theory there, someone somewhere knows that Ged is going to return to that meadow. So as he does, and she's there in her white dress with the white flowers and this unity of alien presence, if you like, within this scene, this is already an entrance into fairy. So regardless of whether he remembers her or not, it's another indication that we are outside of Ged's normal realm of experience. And then, of course, we cap it. He found it hard to speak to her and hard to look away from her. This is literal enchantment. This is, elves are glamorous. They weave themselves in a glamour. They are enchanting. They weave enchantment, right? I'm paraphrasing the wonderful Terry Pratchett there from Lords and Ladies. But that is what elves do. That is what fairies do. And of course, I should clarify here, for those of you who are not keeping up with my There and Back Again series about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the word fairy and the word elf are absolutely interchangeable. We are talking about the same thing. We are talking about the denizens of the realm of fairy, capital F-A-E-R-I-E, right? That is the realm that we're talking about here. So he is enchanted by her even in this moment. Now, yes, this is tying back to his his recent experience with the shadow, but also he is enchanted. He found it hard to speak to her and hard to look away from her. Then the princely clothes he wore were strange to him. The stones he stood on were unfamiliar. The very air he breathed was alien. He was not himself, not the self he had been. Again, all of this is true because of his experience with the shadow and because he's literally in Oskill, but it's also true because he has now metaphorically undergone this journey into fairy. Yeah. Okay. Ryan says, I always hear bells when women walk in. Certainly if you work in some kind of store, you know, that oftentimes happens when you go to the CVS. Yes. Let me see. We're doing fan fiction. There's been some fan fiction has happened here in the chat that I have completely missed. Yes. Oh, okay. So Seastar and Guildarts and Jin are talking about the story of Surratt. Jin says, I want the Surratt story about her escaping an evil mother, growing up from being an ugly duckling and planning to murder her gross old husband to take his fortune. You know what? This is absolutely fair. This is one of the things that makes this feel more mythic. No, that's not fair. It doesn't feel more mythic than it is. It is exactly as mythic as it is. But it is one of the things that makes this chapter feel mythic is that we have this incredibly rich detail, right? We drop into a story that's already underway. We drop into this chapter could have started with, now once long ago, there was a great citadel of Terranon, and within the citadel lay the white woman, the lady of the Lord. We could tell this story from first principles in a fairy tale mode, in a kind of folkloric mode, and it would work just perfectly. Okay, it is now 10 o'clock and I'm nothing like as far through this as I wanted to be, so we need at the very least to get out of this chapter. So let's see what we can do. This takes us to I've kind of skipped ahead here. The shadow can't come into the castle because of the powerful magic that Surratt tells him is binding the castle, which is great. But Ged is cold. He is repeatedly cold, and as he stays here, he gets colder and colder still. If this was strange, it was only part of the strangeness of this place and his presence in it. Ged's mind never seemed quite to clear. He could not see things plainly. He had come to this tower keep by chance, and yet the chance was all design. Or had he come by design, and yet all the design had merely chanced to come about? He had set out northward. A stranger in Oromie had told him to seek help here. An Oscillian ship had been waiting for him. Skior had guided him. How much of this was the work of the shadow that hunted him? Or was none of it? Had he and his hunter both been drawn here by some other power, he following that lure and the shadow following him and seizing on Skior for its weapon when the moment came? That must be it. For certainly the shadow was, as Surratt had said, barred from the court of the Terranon. He had felt no sign or threat of its lurking presence since he wakened in the tower. But what then had brought him here? For this was no place one came to by chance. Even in the dullness of his thoughts, he began to see that. No other stranger came to these gates. The tower stood aloof and remote, its back turned on the way to Nesham that was its nearest town. No man came to the keep. None left it. Its windows looked down on desolation. From these windows, Ged looked out, as he kept by himself in the high tower room day after day, dull and heartsick and cold. It was always cold in the tower, for all the carpets and tapestried hangings and the rich furred clothing and the broad marble fireplaces they had. It was a cold that got into the bone, into the marrow, and would not be dislodged. And in Ged's heart, a cold shame settled also and would not be dislodged, as he thought always of how he had faced his enemy and been defeated and had run. In his mind, all the masters of Roke gathered, Gensher the Archmage frowning in their midst, and Nemerle was with them, and Guin, and even the witch who had taught him his first spell. All of them gazed at him, and he knew he had failed their trust in him. He would plead, saying, if I had not run away, the shadow would have possessed me. It had already all Skir's strength and part of mine, and I could not fight it. It knew my name. I had to run away. A wizard Gabbeth would be a terrible power for evil and ruin. I had to run away. But none of those who listened in his mind would answer him. And he would watch the snow falling thin and ceaseless on the empty lands below the window and feel the dull cold grow within him till it seemed no feeling was left to him except a kind of weariness. Seeing here the evaporation of Ged's essence, of that fire of identity and agency which defines us all, of that personality, that spark of personality, that blaze of personality that defines us all, being slowly leached out of Ged here by the constant cold, the ethereal, unearthly, fairy-tinged cold of the court of Terranon. And we're drawn to this conclusion, of course, in a couple of ways. I guess we're looking at the latter half here. We're going to go back to talk about, hey, chance if chance you call it. We're going to go back to talk about that in just a moment. But it was always cold in the tower. It was a cold that got into the bone, into the marrow, and could not be dislodged. And in Ged's heart, a cold shame settled also and would not be dislodged. Again, Le Guin using the word dislodged there. Remember, we just talked about the stirring of Hoeg in Ged's pocket, right? The same kind of connection called back there. The two things stir, and thus those two things are drawn together, are unified in our perception. So here we have the idea that two colds have settled within Ged, and neither can be dislodged. And we must ask, of course, are there two colds? Are there two things within Ged? Is it the cold of this tower fortress and the cold of shame, or are these things one and the same? Is this the sorcery of the court of Terranon working upon Ged? Well, it seems to be. He's here remembering everyone who has taught him, everyone who has entrusted him with power, in a sense, and thinking of how he has failed them. But that's never been Ged's perspective on power. He has been afraid, but has he ever felt that he has failed in his potential, that he has failed in his obligation, that he has somehow not lived up to the promise that he displayed way back on Gaunt at the beginning of the book? Well, I'm not sure that he has. And then we get this attributed dialogue. He would plead, right? So even the witch who taught him his first spell, all of them gazed at him, and he knew he had failed their trust in him. He would plead repeatedly, right? This is a thing that he would do every time he found himself in this position. He would plead, saying, if I had not run away, the shadow would have possessed me. It had already all Skir's strength and part of mine, and I could not fight it. It knew my name. I had to run away. A wizard Gabbeth would be a terrible, powerful evil and ruin. I had to run away. But none of those who listened in his mind would answer him. Is Ged right? Is Ged wrong? Should he have fought the shadow? Should he have fought to the bitter end? Should he have, instead of turning on his heel and fleeing, climbing the hill as he did back in the Sunless Land beyond the Veil there, should he have fought the shadow to a standstill, to ultimate destruction? Well, no. And certainly failing to fight the Gabbeth, failing to fight the shadow, failing to fight this thing in the form of Skior is not a betrayal of his power. Why couldn't Ged fight back against the shadow? Because the shadow bound him with his name, and because he was in a place he didn't know. Because he had, in a sense, as soon as he leaves the coast behind and starts entering into Oskill in the company of Skior, finds himself in Fairy, right? That we're going through this transition here. We're crossing the threshold into Fairy as we move into this dry, dark land. And there are comparisons drawn too between the dry, fearsome land of Oskill and this shadowy, sunless land of the dead. So could Ged have fought the shadow? Well, no. His power had already been taken from him. There's no response that he could summon that says, well, if I just tried harder, I should have cast a spell. Oh, I didn't think of that. Okay, right, wait. Next time I see the shadow, I'm definitely going to cast a spell, though. That's what I'm going to do. That's going to take care of the problem entirely. He didn't have that option. The shadow bound him by his name, so he couldn't transform, and he didn't know the names of the things around him, so he couldn't wield that power. So is he right to feel this shame? I don't think that shame is an appropriate response for Ged at this point, particularly not the Ged that we've followed through the course of this book. Fear, yes. Isolation, yes. Hopelessness, yes. Despair even, yes. But not shame, surely. Let's look at the first half here to kind of try to discern what has happened here. Let me actually catch up with the chat here because I'm sure you guys all have things to say about shame. Nikki says, I'm surprised the shame doesn't come from calling forth the shadow in the first place. That's so strong, right? You're absolutely right. That's a really great observation. If he's going to feel shame about anything, how about giving in to the well, okay, again, if we take a literal read of the book, giving into the torment and the taunting of Jasper back on Roke, or if we give, some credence to the more nuanced and kind of, intertextual reading of the book, just not being a jerk to Jasper in the first place, just not being such an arrogant brat when he went to Roke in the first place, not being such a, Jake Lloyd as Anakin Skywalker, when he went to wizard school in the first place. Yeah, that's a great focal point. That's a lightning rod for shame right there. Hey, how about not being such a jerk, Ged? How about not causing this in the first place, but not standing up to the shadow when you have no choice? I don't know. The shame there does not read as true to me. let me see here. Oh, C-Star there. The chat just scrolled and I missed it. Yeah, C-Star says, I wonder how the keep gets its food if no one ever enters or leaves it. Maybe all of its winter food is stored there. I think that this is fairy. Where does the food come from? From wherever it needs to, I suppose. I'm not necessarily sure that we're supposed to think of the court of Taranon as being supported by, 50 square leagues of farmland all around it here in Oskill, or necessarily even trading with its local town. As I said, its back is turned on the town, which is such a great image. I love the idea that the fortress is constructed. I mean, okay, if this is a tower fortress, right? This tower keep, the idea that the keep there indicating that the tower is supposed to be secure, it has its back turned on the town. Then what is it protecting? Is it supposed to be protecting the town from something that is coming from without some kind of force that is coming across the desolate ruin of Oskill here to the tower? I don't get that sense. I get the sense that it's supposed to stand alone, and thus its food may just be magical in nature. Okay, let me see. Yes, Nikki says there's still error in Ged's judgment. Ged should never have summoned the shadow in the first place. He is only fretting about the response to the action. Yes, that's very, very good. Excellent. We're talking about Professor Lupin. This is great. Oh, Jen is calling out Professor Lupin. Oh, Jen says, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Get the boy some chocolate. To which Becca replies, right, Lupin would be such a useful add to this book. And Jen replies, Lupin is a useful add in most every book. Gentle masculinity, calm wisdom, an impeccable sense of justice. Be the Remus Lupin you want to see in the world, you guys. That is great advice here for the end of 2017, I think. Good. Good. Oh, and Rayla Lynn's calling out more Frodo parallels, magic sanctuaries, cold wounds, consuming evil. Here's a question that I definitely can't get into, right? I can't spend the next 20 minutes talking about this. I'm going to leave you guys to think about this on your own. To what degree is Ged's arc the same arc as Frodo's minus Sam? Let me put that another way. If Ged had a Sam, I mean, he kind of does, right? Vetch is a kind of Sam, but he drops out of the narrative pretty early on. But if Ged had a Sam Gamgee, like a stalwart Samwise Gamgee by his side throughout all of these adventures, what would Ged's story have looked like? And of course, for those of you who are coming in late, Ursula K. Le Guin was a huge fan of Professor Tolkien's work, was a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings, remains to this day a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings, and was so inspired by that book in her pursuit of fantasy fiction that it isn't actually a trite comparison to make, right? This isn't but what would George R.R. Martin say, or what would Raymond E. Feist say, or what would David Eddings say, or what would Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman say about Professor Tolkien's work? It's not quite that trite. All fantasy writers refer to the master, refer to Professor Tolkien. It's not quite that. Ursula K. Le Guin is actually deliberately and consciously echoing Professor Tolkien in many ways, in many movements here in her story. So, speaking of which, that was the perfect segue, because you guys, as I said, chance if chance you call it. He could not see things plainly. He had come to this tower keep by chance, and yet the chance was all design. Or he had come by design, and yet all the design had merely chanced to come about. What has led Ged to this point? What has led him to the court of Taranon? What has led him to Oskill? What has led him through his confrontation with the shadow? Why is he here? Is this chance? Is this just a sequence of events that have no guiding purpose, no guiding plan, no guiding intellect here? Excuse me. Or is there a guiding intellect? Has something led him to this point? Is he caught now in the threads of, if not an outright conspiracy, then at least a plan? Why is he here? Is this chance if chance you call it, or is this actually a plan that has depended upon things that look like chance? As he says, he had set out northward. A stranger in Oromie had told him to seek help here. Okay, so first off, he had set out northward. He had set out northward from Serd after trying to go back to Roke. Okay, so his first thought, go to Roke. Roke was like, nah, though, actually, nah, because of your shadow and the great evil that you're bringing with you. So shoo, says the Roke wind. So he goes back to Serd and he's like, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to go north. That's my plan. I'm going to go north. Let's see what happens then. Okay, so he makes that decision himself. But here it's interesting that Ged doesn't attribute to himself a part in this grander conspiracy, or a part in this grander sequence of coincidences and chance events. He had set out northward. He, brackets, made the decision to set out northward. A stranger in Oromie had told him to seek help here. An Oscilian ship had been waiting for him. Skior had guided him. How much of this was the work of the shadow that hunted him? Is all of this orchestrated by the shadow? Is that possible? Or was none of it? Had he and his hunter both been drawn here by some other power? He following that lure and the shadow following him and seizing on Skior for its weapon when the moment came? Well, that must be it, he continues, having answered this rhetorical question for himself. That must be it, for certainly the shadow was, as Surratt had said, barred from the court of the Terranon. Wait, what? Okay, so Surratt tells you that the shadow can't come here, and certainly you feel no presence of the shadow, Ged. That's absolutely fair. But that means that you coming here couldn't have been a part of the shadow's plan? You are awfully sure about what the shadow wants and how the shadow is moving toward that thing, though, right? Aren't you? Because the shadow was definitely in Skior, and Skior was definitely going to the court of the Terranon. So is your assertion here that Skior, prior to being overtaken by the shadow, prior to being turned into a Gebeth, was already a part of this complicated plan to get you to the court of the Terranon? And it just so happened that he was taken over by the shadow? That it was... where is the phrase here? The shadow had seized on Skior for its weapon when the moment came. Here he felt no sign or threat of its lurking presence since he wakened in the tower. But what then had brought him here? For this was no place one came to by chance. Even in the dullness of his thoughts, he began to see that. So even here, as he is still laboring under the enchantment of the court of Terranon, still laboring under the enchantment of Surratt, still laboring under the influence of Fairy here, he is beginning to understand that this didn't just happen. Something somehow caused this to be. It might be chance, but if it's chance, then it's chance that is being orchestrated somehow, right? This is not just a random sequence of events. This is a semi-random sequence of events. Something has led him here. Yeah. Good. Let me see here. That's eucatastrophe, says Becca Eller. Everybody drink. Is it eucatastrophe? No, actually. I think that there are two major ways in which Ursula K. Le Guin's work is differentiated from Professor Tolkien's work. And I say two major ways, but what I mean is one major way. For those of you who haven't listened to There and Back Again in our discussion of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, there is a concept in Tolkien's work, eucatastrophe. This is the good catastrophe, right? This is the coming to sudden disaster that is turned and restored, that it is that good things arise from evil, right? That good things necessarily arise from evil, in fact, is one of the fundamental elements of Tolkien's philosophy, but that in moments of absolute crisis, when all seems lost, good things can happen. But there is a sense in which we must be broken first. There is a sense in which the catastrophe has to occur in order for the good thing to happen. We have to lose hope before hope can be restored to us. And we've talked about this throughout There and Back Again in different versions and in different forms. But it is my contention, it is my thesis here, that what Professor Tolkien is actually talking about is predicated in his faith, in his theology. And the professor was a staunch Catholic throughout most of his life. And I say a staunch Catholic throughout most of his life only to acknowledge those times in which his fervent faith moved in slightly different directions. But for most of his life, he was absolutely, a conventional. He was of the conventionally Catholic faith. Anyway, all of that is to say that in the professor's hands, eucatastrophe becomes an opportunity for a kind of intercessory grace. That is to say that the universe at a fundamental level is just and is good and is governed, that there is actually a presence. The presence of God does actually bring light into the universe, right? The cracks, right? The cracks are where the light comes in. That's the idea here. So that seems to be true of Tolkien's approach to eucatastrophe, and is at a higher level reflective of Tolkien's approach to faith and matters theological. Ursula K. Le Guin, much less interested in faith as a means of living one's life, as a moral compass, as a moral framework. In fact, much less interested in religion. She writes much more atheistic, almost entirely atheistic fantasy fiction. As you'll see in this book, there's really no reference to gods or prayer or observance of any kind in these books at all. And when there is, it is presented in a kind of lower key, kind of pantheistic, more folkloric kind of way once you get into the later books in the series. So because she doesn't believe in God in quite that way, because God is not a presence in Earthsea as he is in Middle Earth, the opportunities for eucatastrophe aren't there, because there actually isn't anything deep down at the roots of the world that shines a light through those cracks. There isn't a constant force of restoration and preservation in the world, in Le Guin's world, in the way that there is in Tolkien's world. So that's actually a pretty stark disconnection. I'm not sure that there are moments that I would consider to be eucatastrophic in Le Guin's writing. That's a very large thing that I just said, and I really need to think about that. And many of you, I'm sure, are typing in the chat right now examples that you can think of. But for me, I'm not sure that I can think of any examples at all. Okay. Yes, Father John says, I believe that Le Guin is an atheist. Yes, personally, she is an atheist. Yes, she is an avowed atheist. And that is very much consistent with Le Guin's kind of humanist resistance to labels and kind of conventional labels in particular. Okay, I've got to keep moving on because it's 20 after 10 and we've still got a lot to cover. Segoy, though, says Eve, yes, Segoy raises the islands and creates Earthsea, right? But Segoy is treated in completely and comprehensively mythic terms, not in religious terms. Do the people of Earthsea pray to Segoy? It doesn't seem so. It seems as though we acknowledge Segoy as less of a creator and more as a hero of antiquity, right? Which kind of ties into the idea that Earthsea may be, in fact, some kind of post-apocalyptic world rather than an original secondary creation, right? There certainly are arguments about that. Okay, we've got to keep moving onward. It's a really great conversation that I would like to have in greater depth. Okay, so let's put a pin in that right now. Let's put a pin in this whole idea of purpose and fate and chance, if chance you call it, and move into the Terranon itself. Hey, because it turns out there's a big evil rock here. What is this jewel that gives your keep its name? He asked her as they sat talking over their emptied gold plates and gold goblets in the cavernous candlelit dining hall. You have not heard of it. It is a famous thing. No, I know only that the lords of Oskill have famous treasuries. This jewel that shines them all. Come, would you like to see it? She smiled with a look of mockery and daring, as if a little afraid of what she did, and led the young man from the hall, out through the narrow corridors at the base of the tower and downstairs underground to a locked door he had not seen before. This she unlocked with a silver key, looking up at Ged with that same smile as she did so, as if she dared him to come on with her. Beyond the door was a short passage and a second door, which she unlocked with a gold key, and beyond that again a third door, which she unlocked with one of the great words of unbinding. Within that last door, her candle showed them a small room like a dungeon cell, floor, walls, ceiling, all rough stone, unfurnished, blank. Do you see it? Surratt asked. As Gad looked round the room, his wizard's eye caught one stone of those that made the floor. It was rough and dank as the rest, a heavy, unshapen paving stone, yet he felt the power of it as if it spoke to him aloud, and his breath caught in his throat, and a sickness came over him for a moment. This was the founding stone of the tower. This was the central place, and it was cold, bitter cold. Nothing could ever warm the little room. This was a very ancient thing. An old and terrible spirit was prisoned in that block of stone. He did not answer Surratt yes or no, but stood still, and presently, with a quick, curious glance at him, she pointed out the stone. That is the Terranon. Do you wonder that we keep so precious a jewel, locked away in our deepest hoard room? So now we have our answer. Now we see the stone of the Terranon. Now we see the foundation stone of the tower itself, a magical artifact of ancient evil with an evil spirit prisoned within it, entrapped within it. This is the foundation stone of the tower in more than a physical sense, certainly much more than a physical sense. If it's here in the middle of the room, it probably isn't in any significant way a foundation stone for the entire tower. But what it is, metaphorically speaking, is the anchor point of this keep, of the anchor point of all of the court of Terranon. It is literally built upon this ancient evil magic. It literally is otherworldly. It is a magical realm. It is a fairy-inflected realm. And now we begin to see, again, we get, in case we're doubting the fairiness of the court of Terranon, here we get another very traditional echo of elven magic, right? At first, she uses the key of silver, then the key of gold, then the key of magic, a word of powerful unbinding here. This is beautiful stuff. This is classic fairy tale stuff here as we get to the Terranon. So Ged is uncomfortable with the stone. He's freaked out by it, even as we see here in this slide. She admits at this point that the guy that Ged met in Ormy was sent by her. So she did actually send someone out. This was not chance, if chance you call it. This was part of the greater conspiracy. Yes, that guy who said, "Oh, Oskill, they can definitely hook you up, dude." Yes, he was sent by Surratt. She then tries to convince Ged that the Terranon isn't evil, which for those of us who have recently been reading The Lord of the Rings may feel a little familiar. And this is the conversation that we get that gives the title to tonight's session. I'm very glad that we're covering this. This may be, what do we have? 3 slides left before we finish this chapter. Let's see if we can do 3 more slides before we wrap up tonight. "He who throws away his power is filled sometimes with a far greater power," she said, smiling, as if his fears and scruples were childish ones. "I may know more of you than what brought you here. Did not a man speak to you in the streets of Ormy? He was a messenger, a servant of the Terranon. He was a wizard once himself, but he threw away his staff to serve a power greater than any mage's. And you came to Oskill, and on the moors you tried to fight a shadow with your wooden staff, and almost we could not save you, for that thing that follows you is more cunning than we deemed, and has taken much strength from you already. Only shadow can fight shadow. Only darkness can defeat the dark. Listen, Sparrowhawk, what do you need then to defeat that shadow which waits for you outside these walls? I need what I cannot know. Its name. The Terranon, that knows all births and deaths and beings before and after death, the unborn and the undying, the bright world and the dark one, will tell you that name. And the price? There is no price. I tell you that it will obey you, serve you as your slave." Shaken and tormented, he did not answer. She held his hand now in both of hers, looking into his face. The sun had fallen into the mists that dulled the horizon, and the air, too, had grown dull. But her face grew bright with praise and triumph as she watched him and saw his will shaken within him. Softly she whispered, "You will be mightier than all men, a king among men. You will rule, and I will rule with you." Suddenly Ged stood up, and one step forward took him where he could see, just around the curve of the long room's wall beside the door, the Lord of the Terranon, who stood listening and smiling a little. Ged's eyes cleared, and his mind. He looked down at Surratt. "It is light that defeats the dark," he said, stammering. "Light." "Oh," Father John says, "the father of lies." Speaking, and Becca says, "This is so an Adam and Eve knowledge of good and evil thing." Yes, isn't it? Isn't this as profound an exploration of good and evil as any you've ever read? This is just wonderful, wonderful stuff. And she is, of course, playing the seductress here. Not just in a sexual sense, though I think you can probably infer that too, particularly when we get to, "You will be mightier than all men, a king among men. You will rule, and I will rule with you." Like, you and me, though, huh? You and me, though. But it's more than that. It's the seduction of power. "Only darkness can defeat the dark." She says, "Listen, Sparrowhawk, what do you need then to defeat the shadow which waits for you outside these walls?" And he says, "I need what I cannot know, its name." The dragon. The dragon could have told me its name, but I couldn't do that to the people of Low Torning. I had to, moral high road. Okay, I had to do the right thing then and not get the name of the shadow that follows me. So now I have to find another way to do it. That's what I need. And she says, "The Terranon that knows all births and deaths and beings before and after death, the unborn and the undying, the bright world and the dark world, will tell you that name." Great news. This stone right here, it can tell you the name of the shadow that follows you. And it's like, right, but it's super evil. You're super shady. What is the price? And she says, "No price. I tell you, it will obey you, serve you as a slave." And even then, we're getting a clue, an outright statement, I suppose, much more emphatic and powerful than a clue, that this is not okay. That the domination of this power which is unlike that of wizards, right? We've been talking all the way through the book about other kinds of magic and other kinds of power, that basically a wizard's power is the power to command things in the old tongue, the power to command things in the Hardic language. That's basically all that wizards can do. It's just learning names. That's what wizards are. They're people who know the names of things. This is clearly a very different kind of magic. And you'll note here too, the Terranon that knows all births and deaths and beings before and after death, the unborn and the undying, the bright world and the dark one. Again, Surratt here is kind of presenting to us these sets of paired oppositions, this idea that there is a fundamental conflict at the heart of the universe, right? That dark, not the absence of light. The shadow is the antithesis of light, because they both orbit the object. They both orbit the real world, or whatever thing it is that is casting that shadow, as we've talked about before. Okay. Good. Yes, as Ryan says, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yes, very, very good. Okay, excellent. Oh, interesting. Jin says there's a strong theme running through this book in distrusting wealth and the ownership class. Huh. In a sense, I think that's true. I need to give that some more thought, I think. You're right. There is something that isn't quite as firmly feudalistic as Professor Tolkien would have been. The idea of a well-ordered society kind of taking as read, kind of enfolding into its structures and adopting happily a schism of social rank, or a hierarchy of social rank, at least. Professor Tolkien was very big on that idea, and that doesn't seem to have made it into the pages of Earthsea, which is entirely expected, of course, because politically Ursula K. Le Guin is pretty far left, like much further left than Professor Tolkien would have been. I think that's probably fair to say. He was much more small c conservative, I think, than Le Guin is. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'll need to give that some thought, and certainly give some thought to how that echoes out to Harry Potter, because that may well be one of the things that unites A Wizard of Earthsea and Harry Potter, beyond the, boy with extraordinary powers goes off to wizard school and faces an ancient evil structure of the story. I'm not taking a single Harry Potter novel there, but the Harry Potter series as a whole. I think there might be a kind of, a kind of punkish, rebellious, anti-authoritarian, anti-institutional kind of sensibility to these stories. That's something I'll definitely have to think about. That's a really good observation. Okay, let's keep going, because we've got a couple things to do. So we run, we flee. He realizes at this point that Surette and her husband Benderisk were both conspiring against him, that this is a setup, that nothing good is going to come of this. We get the reveal that Surette is in fact the daughter of the Lord of Rayalby, who we met back in the meadow back at the beginning of the book so long ago, if we hadn't already figured this out. Oh, also Hoeg is dead. I mean, I didn't pull the slide because I don't know why I would do that to you here. Isn't 2017 hard enough without me pulling the slide describing the death of Ged's little Otik there? We get the summoning of the servants of the stone to kill Surette and Ged. We get Surette wielding powerful magic to introduce molten lead into the veins of the servants, which is terrifying and awful and chilling in more than one sense. Then Surette turns into a gull and tries to flee rather. Ged tries to stay and fight. He's ready to do this thing. Then finally transforms into the falcon and flies away. And we transition to a Guin. This is actually the leaving. I'm sorry, I've got the wrong slide here. This is I guess I didn't note this slide. Maybe we've got more than I thought to get through. Quick as he had once done at Roke, Ged took the shape of a great hawk, not the sparrow hawk they called him, but the pilgrim falcon that flies like an arrow, like thought. On barred, sharp, strong wings he flew, pursuing his pursuers. The air darkened, and among the clouds stars shone brightening. Ahead he saw the black ragged flock all driving down, and in upon one point in midair. Beyond that black clot the sea lay, pale with the last ashy gleam of day. Swift and straight the hawk Ged shot toward the creatures of the stone, and they scattered as he came amongst them as water droplets scatter from a cast pebble. But they had caught their prey. Blood was on the beak of this one, and white feathers stuck to the claws of another, and no gulls skimmed beyond them over the pallid sea. Already they were turning on Ged again, coming quick and ungainly with iron beaks stretched out agape. He, wheeling once above them, screamed the hawk's scream of defiant rage, and then shot on across the low beaches of Oskill, out over the breakers of the sea. The creatures of the stone circled a while, croaking, and one by one beat back ponderously inland over the moors. The old powers will not cross the sea, being bound each to an isle, a certain place, cave or stone or welling spring. Back went the black emanations to the tower keep, where maybe the lord of the Terranon, Benderisk, wept at their return, and maybe laughed. But Ged went on, falcon-winged, falcon-mad, like an unfalling arrow, like an unforgotten thought, over the Oskill sea and eastward into the wind of winter and the night. Impeccably written. Once again, you'll note we get that narrative intrusion, right? We take the step back from the story. The creatures of the stone circled a while, croaking, one by one, beat ponderously inland over the moors. Parenthetically, The old powers will not cross over the sea, being bound each to an isle, a certain place, cave or stone or welling spring. So just, FYI, here's a little detail about the old powers, these ancient powers that underpin the earth, that care not for the conventions of name and naming, right? These are not bound by the same power or by the same structures that limit Ged's ability. He is of wizardry. He is of the Hardic word. He is not of these ancient powers. And we've had references to these ancient powers right from the beginning of the book all the way through. This is our closest run-in. We see, of course, the death here of Surette in her gull form. But much more importantly, Ged has been cast into the form of the Falcon. That incredibly creepy. Back when the black emanations of the Tower Keep were maybe the Lord of the Terran on Benderesk wept at their return and maybe laughed. I really love and dislike that line. It's very, very creepy. But Ged went on, falcon winged, falcon mad, like an unfalling arrow, like an unforgotten thought. That's beautifully written, right? This elemental momentum across the face of the world, this thing that cannot be and yet is, this defiance. That's what we're getting, right? The unfalling arrow. What is the nature of arrows? But to fall, but not this arrow. What is the nature of thoughts? To be forgotten, but not this thought. In defiance, Ged streaks out across the ocean, seeking safety. And yet losing himself to falcon mad, on falcon winged, falcon mad, like an unfalling arrow, like an unforgotten thought. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. All right, now we get to a Guin. Here we go. This is the slide I thought I was going to read to you. I forgot that I pulled that last one. Just couldn't help myself. Beautifully written. Here we go. Are you messenger or message? A Guin said gently to the hawk. Come on with me. As he spoke, the hawk looked at him. A Guin was silent a minute. I named you once, I think, he said, and then strode to his house and entered, bearing the bird still on his wrist. He made the hawk stand on the hearth in the fire's heat and offered it water. It would not drink. Then a Guin began to lay a spell very quietly, weaving the web of magic with his hands more than his words. When the spell was whole and woven, he said softly, Ged, not looking at the falcon on the hearth. He waited some while, then turned and got up and went to the young man who stood trembling and dull-eyed before the fire. Ged was richly and outlandishly dressed in fur and silk and silver, but the clothes were torn and stiff with sea salt, and he stood gaunt and stooped, his hair lank about his scarred face. A Guin took the soiled princely cloak off of his shoulders, led him down to the alcove room where his prentice once had slept, and made him lie down on the pallet there, and so with a murmured sleep charm left him. He had said no word to him, knowing that Ged had no human speech in him now. The camera trick here, the cinematic camera trick here of not seeing, not showing, not demonstrating the transformation is utterly perfect. It is a bold move, right? We could get the kind of cheap, again, right? We could do some of that late 90s CGI. We can do some of that Robert Patrick in Terminator 2, fluid CGI morphing thing here, as we described earlier with Skiora's face kind of blurring into the shape of the shadow and then returning to its normal form. This is different. This is much more powerful. When the spell was whole and woven, he said softly, Ged, not looking at the falcon on the hearth. He waited some while, then turned and got up and went to the young man who stood trembling and dull-eyed before the fire. That's it. It happens off screen. We're still fixed on a Guin. We're watching a Guin here. We're not looking at the transformation. But when the camera pans back, when a Guin turns and returns to the fire, the bird is gone. And there now is a young man with no speech in him. It's pretty great. Yes, C-Star says Ged didn't go unconscious here, but he sort of lost his consciousness in a different way as a falcon. I would count this actually 5 times in the book so far that Ged has lost consciousness one way or another. Let's wrap this up then with our final slide of the evening. We're not going to get to chapter 8 tonight, but that leaves us with chapters 8, 9, and 10 for next week. This is the conclusion of our discussion with a Guin, though. Those are bitter scars you bear, lad, he said. I have no strength against the thing, Ged answered. A Guin shook his head, but said no more for a time. At length, strange, he said. You had strength enough to outspell the sorcerer in his own domain there in Osgil. You had strength enough to withstand the lures and fend off the attack of the servants of an old power of earth. And at Pandora, you had strength enough to stand up to a dragon. It was luck I had in Osgil, not strength, Ged replied, and he shivered again as he thought of the dreamlike, deathly cold of the court of the Terranon. As for the dragon, I knew his name. The evil thing, the shadow that haunts me, has no name. All things have a name, said Guin, so certainly that Gad dared not repeat what the Archmage Genscher had told him, that such evil forces as he loosed were nameless. The Dragon of Pendor indeed had offered to tell him the Shadow's name, but he put little trust in the truth of that offer, nor did he believe Surette's promise that the stone would tell him what he needed to know. If the Shadow has a name, he said at last, I do not think it will stop and tell it to me. No, said Guin, nor Manavune stopped and told it your name, and yet it knew it. On the moors in Oskill it called you by your name, the name I gave you. It is strange, strange. And it is fitting, of course, that this entire conflict, that this entire story should come back to the power of names. Let me take a look here. Yes, Ryan says, even though he lost his consciousness in the Falcon, he still made his way to Guin. Yeah, there is obviously the extended part in this chapter where he kind of accounts for that journey. I didn't want to pull that whole thing out, but it is utterly, utterly fascinating. And another kind of connection back to Terry Pratchett too. Nikki says the same happens in Daughter of the Forest. A girl's brothers are cursed and turns into swans, and one brother spends so long as a swan he begins to forget he was ever human. Yes, that is the danger that comes to witches who borrow in Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. If you, it's not actually a transformation, but it is the sending out of one's mind into an animal, and you spend so long in that form, in that awareness, that you forget to come back. And of course, Animorphs did that whole story, right? Wasn't there an Animorph who... Eagle? Was there an eagle Animorph who transformed into an eagle and stayed there? Isn't there some kind of temporal MacGuffin in the Animorphs books? I haven't touched or seen or, heaven help me, thought about an Animorphs book in 20 years easily. Isn't there some kind of, you can stay in animal form for an hour or something, a period of time anyway, and after that you're stuck, that's it, you're done? A natural element of transformation stories, right? Of transformation magic within the fairy tale tradition. Certainly, there are lots of stories of people taking another form and then staying in that form for so long that they are lost to themselves. And that's kind of itself an extension of this fairy idea, that you travel into fairy and you must not linger there because fairy is seductive and fairy is corruptive, and you cannot come back to the mortal realm whole or complete or without great loss, without paying a great price. Right, good. That's going to do it. Yes. Oh, this is great. Lily says, reminds me of the minor spoilers for Thor Ragnarok, I guess. Lily says, reminds me of the if I turn into Hulk again, Banner may never return drama from Ragnarok. That's good. Yes. Yes, excellent. Father John's quoting from Discworld, I ain't dead. This is one of the little signs that Granny Weatherwax writes and pins to herself when she is out borrowing, when she is sending her mind out into the world, so that people who come to her little witch's cottage and find her there cold and in repose don't assume that she's dead and start, making off with her silver teaspoons and making arrangements for her burial. She just has a little sign that says, I ain't dead. I like that very much. All right. Oh, good. Oh, I should give credit to Sosa Sundari. It was also quoting that too. That's excellent. Good. All right, guys, that is going to do it. Let me cancel this slide. In fact, let me cancel the slide so that I can advance to the end of my run here and get through the slides that I didn't get to cover tonight. Not that many, actually. We're only a few behind, and I can share this with you. Next week, we are going to look at Chapter 8, Hunting. We're also going to look at Chapter 9, Iffish, and Chapter 10, The Open Sea. That's actually okay, because I only have a couple of slides for Chapter 8, and Chapters 9 and 10 are a little shorter than the others, so we should be able to make through this in a 2-hour session. It should be just fine. That is going to be at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, December the 19th, 2017. That's next week, you guys. December the 19th is next week, 1 week from tonight. That is going to be our final Dear Mr. Potter of 2017. We're going to wrap up our discussion of A Wizard of Earthsea and then come back on January 2nd, 2018 for our discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. In that first session, we are covering 3 chapters of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We're going to have to move a little more swiftly. Obviously, the books are beginning to expand at this point in the Harry Potter series, so we're going to have to move a little more quickly than we have previously, but we are also going to take longer than we have previously to get through it. I think I have scheduled 15 or 16 sessions to get through Goblet of Fire. So, we're going to take our time with it, but we're also going to move a little more quickly. So that's how that's going to work out into 2018. I think we're going to get 2 Harry Potter books done in 2018, as well as a couple of other novels that we can discuss in the course of our show here. Guys, thank you all so much. Oh, Nikki's calling out in the chat here. Guys, The Last Jedi, who's going? for those of you who are curious, I am going to go and see The Last Jedi on Friday morning. But before that, tomorrow evening, as of this live recording, and possibly even of the podcast recording, depending when I get this podcast out, on the evening of Wednesday, the 13th of December at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, that's an hour earlier than my usual live broadcast slot, I am going live over on YouTube, youtube.com/PointNorthMedia, with a live commentary track for The Force Awakens. I'm going to watch The Force Awakens and talk all over it for, 2 hours, 20 minutes, something like that. I'm very excited to do this. This is just going to whet all of our appetites for going into The Last Jedi, about which I hear wonderful things. I have no spoilers for The Last Jedi and wouldn't give them even if I had them, so you don't have to worry about that. But we are going to talk about The Force Awakens and celebrate this thing called Star Wars. It's the most wonderful time of the year. It's Star Wars time. I can't wait for The Last Jedi. I'm really looking forward to The Force Awakens. If you have the inclination and the time and the space in your schedule right here before the holidays and you would like to join me, head on over to youtube.com/PointNorthMedia at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. Actually, it's like 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 7:30 p.m. Central for the Force Awakens live commentary. You'll need a DVD or a Blu-ray of the movie with you so that you can watch it on a second screen, and then you can have me on your phone or your laptop or your tablet or whatever. Or if you have a dual monitor set up on your desk and you're just going to really do this thing like you mean it, then you can do that. And of course, we can chat there in the YouTube chat too. That is going to do it. Guys, thank you so much for joining me this week on Dear Mr. Potter. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care and good night.